They called my father a thief. They destroyed his name, his honor, and his life. For 20 years, I carried the weight of their lies in silence. But silence can be sharper than any blade. Before you hear my story, tap subscribe and drop a comment if you've ever watched someone you love be torn down by lies, or if you've ever dreamed of proving the world wrong when it counted most. I was 12 the day my father's name turned to ash. The trial was supposed to be fair, open, public, a demonstration of justice. That's what they said anyway. But even at that age, sitting on the cold wooden bench with my mother's trembling hand crushing mine, I knew the verdict had been written long before the gavel fell. Father stood tall in his gray suit, face pale but unbroken. The whispers hissed around us like snakes. Thief. Liar. Cheat. The men who accused him sat smugly in the front row. Men whose children went to private schools. Men who shook hands with mayors and judges at charity galas. Men who built their fortunes on deals scribbled in shadows. I didn't understand the mechanics of corruption then, but I saw their smirks. They weren't afraid. They knew the outcome. When the judge announced guilty, the room erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. My mother buried her face in her hands. My father only glanced back once at me. His eyes weren't pleading. They were apologizing. I didn't cry. Not then. I sat rigid, nails digging crescents into my palms until I bled. That was the first day I learned that silence can scream louder than any voice. The years that followed were a descent into shadows. We lost the house. The bank account froze. My mother took 2 jobs cleaning homes that once belonged to her friends. People crossed the street to avoid us. Former neighbors whispered when we passed, and kids at school mimicked courtroom speeches until I lashed out and got suspended. Father was sent to prison. They said he'd embezzled millions from a charity fund he managed. But I knew the truth. The men who framed him had stolen it themselves. They needed a scapegoat, someone disposable, someone who didn't have the wealth or power to fight back. The night before he died, barely 2 years into his sentence from what they called complications, he wrote me a letter. His handwriting was shaky, almost unrecognizable, but the words cut deep. Jonah, the world will tell you I was a thief. Don't waste your life proving them wrong. Instead, live so that one day, truth doesn't need my name to survive. And never forget, those who stole my honor will answer for it, one way or another. I kept that letter under my pillow until the paper wore thin. From that night on, I swore I wouldn't just live, I would remember. Hope came in fragments, bitter and sharp. I studied harder than anyone else, because education was the only weapon left to me. I watched those men, their names always in the papers, their faces smiling at ribbon cuttings, their businesses thriving, and I memorized everything. At 16, I worked in a dusty law library after school, my hands aching as I shelved books heavier than my arms could carry. But I read them all. Contracts, case law, judicial ethics manuals. I devoured stories of trials won and lost, of loopholes exploited, and systems bent. By 20, I was invisible in lecture halls, the quiet kid with sharp notes and sharper eyes. No one knew I'd memorized every detail of the scandal that killed my father. No one guessed the fury that simmered beneath my calm face when professors praised the very judges and businessmen who had destroyed him. By 30, I was no longer invisible. They called me brilliant, unstoppable, a rising star in law. Some even said I was destined for the bench. I smiled politely at every compliment, every promotion. But inside, I thought of my father's eyes the day the gavel fell, and I sharpened my silence into a blade. The first time I saw him again, Robert Ellison, the man who'd orchestrated my father's ruin, I felt a strange calm. It was at a fundraising gala, the kind dripping with champagne and false laughter. He was older, but not enough. His hair was silver now, his suit tailored, his smile practiced. He shook hands with senators and CEOs as though he hadn't once destroyed a man's life with a lie. I stood across the room, glass in hand, invisible once more. My chest didn't pound. My breath didn't quicken. Instead, I felt a chilling clarity settle over me like a second skin. Ellison was untouchable, or so he thought. That night, as I slipped away from the gala with his laugh still ringing in my ears, I knew. It was time. They had called my father a thief. Now, I would become the judge of their fate. They said the law was blind. I learned quickly it was only blind to those it chose not to see. By the time I entered the judicial system, I had mastered the art of invisibility. I wore the right suits, carried the right briefcase, smiled the right smile. They saw a promising young man with a spotless record, not the boy who once sat in a courtroom watching his father condemned. Robert Ellison saw me for the first time not at the gala, but 6 months later, when I walked into his office as lead counsel for a case his corporation had interest in. His handshake was firm, his eyes assessing, as if he could measure worth in a glance. "Jonah Cross," he said, rolling my name on his tongue, like a fine wine. "I've heard good things." "Only good, I hope," I replied smoothly. Inside, I'll burn my throat. He had no idea he was shaking the hand of the boy whose family he destroyed. I watched his lips curl into a faint smirk. "The best. I think we'll get along just fine." I smiled back. That was the first of many lies I would feed him. The secret to dismantling an empire wasn't force. It was patience. I didn't storm in waving accusations. I let them welcome me, trust me, even confide in me. Ellison's circle, wealthy, entitled, arrogant, saw me as one of their own. I played the part well. Long dinners in private clubs, subtle flattery, quiet efficiency. They mistook my silence for loyalty. And all the while I listened. I learned which senator's son had a gambling problem, which CEO kept 2 families, which judge had debts he couldn't pay. Every whispered confession, every careless brag, I stored like ammunition. At night, I'd return to my apartment, peel off the mask, and study the files I'd been gathering. My father's letter sat on my desk, yellowed now with age, a silent witness to every step I took. "Those who stole my honor will answer for it." "Not yet, father. But soon." The first thread I pulled was small, almost invisible. One of Ellison's closest allies, a man named Gregory Harlan, had a taste for under-the-table deals. He thought his late-night meetings in out-of-the-way restaurants went unnoticed. He was wrong. I didn't expose him immediately. Instead, I nudged. A quiet word to a journalist I knew wouldn't reveal their source. A file anonymously mailed to a competitor. Within weeks, Harlan's name surfaced in a corruption probe. Ellison panicked. I was there when he ranted about betrayal, veins bulging at his temples. "After all we've done for him," he hissed. I only nodded, face calm, though inside triumph flared. A pawn removed, and no one suspected me. But revenge, real revenge, was never about pawns. It was about kings. Ellison trusted me more after Harlan's fall. I'd proven myself loyal, efficient, discreet. He began inviting me to smaller gatherings, the kind where real deals were struck. Men laughed too loudly over whiskey, their words loose, their arrogance unchecked. One night, I followed Ellison to his study after most had left. He poured himself a drink and gestured for me to sit. "You're sharp, Jonah," he said, swirling the amber liquid. "Reminds me of myself years ago." I smiled faintly. "That's kind of you to say." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You're ambitious. I can see it. Ambition can be dangerous if not properly guided." I met his gaze steadily. "And if it is guided?" He chuckled, raising his glass. "Then it becomes power." That was the moment I knew I had him. Ellison thought he was shaping me in his image. He couldn't see that I was already shaping his downfall in mine. The cracks widened slowly. I let whispers of doubt circulate, never from me, always through others. A misplaced document here, a subtle remark there. Soon Ellison began second-guessing those closest to him. He grew more paranoid, more dependent on me. Meanwhile, I fed the press breadcrumbs. Anonymous leaks. Hints of financial irregularities. Enough to stir questions, not yet enough to topple him. At night, I sometimes dreamed of my father. Not the man broken in prison, but the man before, the one who taught me chess, who told me the world wasn't fair, but that truth mattered anyway. In those dreams, he would look at me, silent, waiting. I'd wake with my jaw clenched and my hands trembling. Because the truth was, this wasn't only about justice anymore. It was about me. About the boy who had sat in that courtroom, powerless, while men like Ellison destroyed everything he loved. The night the first article broke, Ellison stormed into his office, newspaper crushed in his fist. "Baseless accusations," he spat, pacing like a caged animal. "They think they can tarnish my name? They think they can drag me down." I stood quietly watching. "Do you want me to look into it?" I asked softly. His eyes flicked to mine, searching for loyalty. "Yes," he said finally. "Find out who's behind this." I nodded. Of course. But I already knew. As the empire cracked, I grew colder, calmer. Sympathy had long since bled out of me, replaced by a precise hunger. They had called my father a thief. But soon, the world would know the truth. Not through whispered defenses. not through a son begging for his father's honor, through the destruction of the men who had built their power on lies. And I would be the one holding the gavel. The night before it all came crashing down, I barely slept. I sat in my apartment surrounded by files, newspaper clippings, and USB drives filled with secrets I'd collected over years. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual neon heartbeat, but I felt no part of it. My whole world narrowed to this moment, this plan. The letter from my father lay on the desk, frayed at the edges. I read it again, my eyes snagging on the last line. Those who stole my honor will answer for it, one way or another. Tomorrow, Father. They'll answer tomorrow. The plan unfolded in stages, not with fireworks, but with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Step 1, exposure. At dawn, carefully timed stories erupted across 3 major newspapers and 2 online outlets. Financial fraud, embezzlement, offshore accounts. Ellison's name was splashed in bold, alongside copies of documents I'd discovered. Step 2, isolation. By noon, senators who once clapped him on the back were avoiding his calls. His business partners issued statements of deep concern. His closest allies, those who still remained, frantically distanced themselves, some offering him up to save their own skins. Step 3, confrontation. I arrived at Ellison's office that afternoon as planned. He was slumped behind his desk, tie loosened, hands shaking over the phone. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. "They're vultures," he muttered when I walked in. "Circling, waiting for the kill. I need to know who fed them this." I closed the door quietly and stepped closer. "Robert," I said softly, "you already know." His eyes snapped up, confusion flickering into suspicion. "What do you mean?" I slid a thin folder onto his desk. Inside were copies of the very documents the papers had printed. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Then he froze. "You," he whispered. "Yes," I said simply. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. "Why? After everything." "Everything." My voice cut sharp, years of silence shattering in an instant. "You destroyed my father. You called him a thief, ruined his name, left him to rot in prison for a crime you committed." Recognition flared in his eyes, and for a moment I saw fear. "Jonah," his voice cracked, "you're his son." I nodded. "And now I'm your judge." He tried denial first, babbling excuses. He was complicit. He knew. I had no choice. "Don't," I snapped. My hands trembled, but not with fear. With the fury of a lifetime condensed into this moment. "I was 12 when you took him from me. 12 when you turned our name to filth. Do you remember what you said in court, Robert? You called him a parasite." Ellison's mouth opened, then closed. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "You thought no one would remember," I said. "But I did." Step 4, the gavel. That evening, the footage aired. A senator's son with a gambling scandal. A judge accepting bribes. A CEO funding offshore accounts, all tied back, through meticulous threads, to Robert Ellison. I had ensured the trail was ironclad, impossible to dismiss. The news cycle exploded. Anchors used words like shocking, unprecedented, systemic corruption. Protesters gathered outside his office. The empire he had built on lies was collapsing in real time. And Ellison? He sat alone in his study, curtains drawn, watching everything crumble. I knew, because I was there, standing in shadows as he poured himself glass after glass of whiskey, hands shaking. "You've ruined me," he whispered hoarsely. I stepped closer, my voice calm, steady. "No, you ruined yourself. I just made sure the world finally saw it." The final blow came not from me, but from the law he had once manipulated. 2 weeks later, Ellison stood in the same courthouse where my father had been condemned. Only this time, the roles were reversed. The reporters were relentless, the gallery packed. I sat in the back row, silent, just as I had as a boy. When the gavel fell, guilty, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not joy, but release. For the first time since I was 12, I could breathe. After the trial, I visited my father's grave. The grass was long, the stone weathered, his name still bearing the stain of falsehood. I knelt, laying the yellowed letter on the cool stone. "It's done," I whispered. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "They called you a thief, Father. But now the world knows the truth." The wind stirred, gentle, as if answering. I stood, straightening my suit. The empire of lies was gone. Justice, my justice, had been served. And I, Jonah Cross, the boy they once left powerless, had become the judge of their fate. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in the room, hidden behind steady eyes and a calm smile your enemies never suspect. If you've ever carried your silence like a weapon, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Your support keeps these stories alive. Until next time, stay steady. Stay unbreakable.